Pleasure to be with you all today. My name is David Marroni. I'm Acting Director of Physical Infrastructure at GAO. Happy to join you all. I know my colleagues have been here many times, so happy to join the group here with Keith Cunningham today and Mike Arms. But I am relatively new to our physical infrastructure team, but when I have been learning these issues about our assets management framework, the concepts are very familiar. I came from our energy group. The very same ideas apply across many of the issue areas that GAO looks at. When we're talking about federal operations, federal assets, the importance of this framing in terms of how we are managing those. So I'm here today to share you a few of our recent reports to highlight how we're using these concepts in our work evaluating federal programs for their effectiveness and efficiency to inform Congress as they do their work. And in particular, in this age with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, providing billions of dollars more in investment, it's really going to be important for these asset management approaches to be applied in a real sensible way to get the most out of those investments. So I'm not going to go over the principles on the slide. You all are experts in asset management, but just as a note, as you know, in 2018, we put out our asset management framework. These are the 6 key principles that we identified from that framework that federal agencies could use to best apply those principles. I think the key thing here is their wide applicability to our work, that in any situation where we're looking at a federal asset is how are you optimizing your funding? How are you using data to systematically prioritize where money is best spent? How can you better achieve your mission goals with how you manage your assets and maybe even save taxpayers a little bit of money, which at GAO we would always be interested in them doing. So as I mentioned, I'm going to highlight 4 examples today. These reports have all come out in the past year and a half or so. And I chose these examples not only because they use asset management concepts, but they use them in slightly different ways, building in equity considerations, building in climate and resilience considerations, and then some infrastructure that's non-traditional, not buildings and roads and bridges we all typically think of, but other assets that the federal government is involved in. And so with that, I'll dive right into the first case study. This is a report hot off the presses, just came out last week. It's on federal planning for office space in the post-pandemic, which, as you can tell, is a really huge topic. A lot of uncertainty now in terms of how much of the federal workforce will be in federal buildings in the next few years. But agencies need to plan for that. And so they'll need data. They'll need good data to figure out how much office space do we need now in this new environment. While it's uncertain how much, I can guarantee you there's going to be more telework. There's going to be fewer people in full-time. So the traditional metrics of full-time workers, 180 square feet per worker, that gets to your number, is not likely going to apply anymore. So we've done this work, came out with our report to see what's the state of play. And basically, agencies right now are in what I'd call a wait and see approach, seeing where things shake out. But importantly, the data they'll need to make those decisions really doesn't seem to be there. We surveyed 24 agencies that represent the vast majority of holders of office space. And of those, 20 had either no or very limited data on the utilization of their office space. So it's going to be hard to make decisions without good quality data on that. It's also an opportunity, though. There's more than half of federal leases are expiring in the next 5 years. So right now is a good time to get that data, figure out where we're going, and make sure we're maximizing the value we get out of these assets. And so we took a look at what is at least being done if there's not great data. And to GSA's credit, they have been pushing for more data. In 2019, they pushed for a requirement to have federal agencies collect more utilization data. That sort of foundered on concerns about the utility of the data, how much it would cost, privacy considerations. Then the pandemic happened, and GSA has continued efforts to collect more data, to pilot technologies to collect that data. As you can see in the graphic, these are just some examples of some ways, badging data, logins, lots of different approaches you could take, but important work that they're doing right now. But as part of our audit, we found that they were not planning to share the results of that data broadly with federal agencies, which to us led to an obvious recommendation of no, please do so. Hopefully to provide not only information that the agencies could use, but also overcome some of those concerns, work through the issues of what are the costs of this data? What is the utility of this data? How can we deal with privacy considerations? And then hopefully have those agencies also collect the data, take advantage of what is a really big opportunity here. We are certainly still in this space. Keith Cunningham is leading work looking at this further, so we will have more to say about this in the months and years ahead. But a great example of the importance of data to asset management. And we find this not just in this space, lots of times at federal agencies, the quality of data is a big problem, something that needs to improve. Second recent work I'll highlight came out in July. This is a slightly different flavor of a report. It's on pavement conditions in the national highway system. Our highways are definitely an asset, but we have applied a unique equity lens in our approach to this report that I think will be of interest to you. So just for context, for those who are not aware, the National Highway System is funded through grants from the Federal Highway Administration to state departments of transportation. The states have a lot of flexibility in determining what projects to fund and where to prioritize those projects, but they do provide data to FHWA on the condition of the pavement in their state, on their road system, based on criteria, poor, good, or fair. And then FHWA will assess that data and say, overall, aggregate for the state, what's the condition of the roadways? If more than 5% of roadways are designated as poor condition, then that has some impact on fencing off certain federal funds to get that issue under control. But it's done at a statewide level. And so we developed a statistical model to look at, well, what about below the statewide level? Are the road conditions consistent across these states, or are we finding areas of concentrated poor pavement? And what we did find is, yes, there are within states areas where there are particularly poor pavement conditions. And also, we found that those poor pavement conditions were more common in areas with certain community characteristics, even after controlling for traffic density, even after controlling for climate effects, and various other factors that you might think of as explanations. And what we found in particular, 3 community groupings: traditionally underserved racial and ethnic groups, high poverty areas, and urban areas in general had poor pavement conditions, even controlling for these factors. Just with the important condition again, correlation does not equal causation. So we don't know why this is what the data shows, but this is what the data shows. I think the graphic here is a good way to illustrate that. So on the left of the axis, reflects census tracts that have the lowest percentage of traditionally underserved ethnic and minority populations. And they have a 22% chance of having good pavement condition on average, tracking all the way down to census tracts with the highest percentage of traditionally underserved communities at a 7% chance. So quite a difference. And the 4 lines represent the different densities from city down to small town. And while the percentages are different, the trend is the same across. So interesting, we thought, okay, this is important for the federal agency working with the states to understand what's going on. So we recommended they dive down as they're considering their asset management approach for these roadways, doing a more granular analysis of why this might be happening. What does this mean for DOT's equity goals? They have those for their transportation funding, and consider strategies they can identify with the states of how to better target these funds, potentially address these equity issues. The agency partially concurred, so they are going to do additional analyses. They are planning to work with the states on that. We think a fuller analysis is still needed, but we'll be keeping an eye on this. But again, highlight this example, I think it shows you can build in considerations beyond just the condition of assets, how you manage them, also equity considerations that right now are a big issue within the federal space. All right, third report. This came out last year right at this time, and this relates to climate resilience of US postal facilities. And I'm highlighting this particular report, again, to show another angle you can take as you're doing asset management approaches, and that is building in resilience concerns, climate resilience concerns in this case. And we were looking at, as everyone knows, there's post offices everywhere. They are subject to all the weather events that we all are in our own hometowns, but These extreme weather events have been increasing, and the postal facilities, processing centers that are essential to their mission being carried out have been taking more damage. Postal Service has had to spend $30 million the past 5 years for those damages, which in the scale of the Postal Service is not that big of a figure. It is increasing, but why it matters for the Postal Service is they're also very financially, they're in a financially poor condition. So any amounts they have to spend on this is a difficulty for them. And then more importantly, operationally, to actually carry out their mission, many of these facilities are critical. So even if the cost was not the main reason for concern, being able to maintain the movement of goods and mail across the country could be affected if you don't consider resilience when you're making things like leasing decisions. Where are you going to build facilities? Is it worth investing in resilience measures to mitigate risk and save yourself from potential longer-term costs down the road? And so we looked at what USPS is doing in this space. And the good news story is on the policy front, on the planning front, they have all the procedures we would expect for them to have from an asset management framework perspective. They have, in fact, requirements in their facility decision-making process, their prioritization processes, to build in resilience considerations at the start of that process, to consider climate data and make those decisions early on about what do we need to do. But then we looked at the practice, and the practice was not consistent with their policy. Bottom line, they were collecting that data and considering resilience measures, but at the end, months after the decision-making process had gone into effect, and much more difficult at that point to shift the battleship, so to speak, at that point and build in potentially useful resilience measures, useful resilience considerations. And so we recommended simply that they, in fact, follow their policy in this case, consider the climate data early on, and make sure as you're managing your assets nationwide that you're taking into account the most recent climate data, the most recent resilience measures, so you can ensure their mission is carried out. And Post Office agreed with that. Thankfully, we had some pretty strong criteria being in their own policy. Finally, the last case study I'll go through today, I highlight because it's not traditional infrastructure we think about, roads, bridges, again. This deals with the National Ambient Air Quality Monitoring System. We did this report back in 2020. And just for context, this is a monitoring system maintained by EPA, the states, and local governments across the country. It basically is a bunch of monitoring sites you can see in the photograph there that collect standardized measurements of air pollution in that area. But that's how you address air quality standards. That's how you enforce the Clean Air Act. So they're a critical national asset that have been in place since the 70s. But importantly, also an aging system since it's been in place since the 70s. Higher costs to maintain, increasing demands, more pollutants are being tracked, and at the same point, in real terms, lower funding in the past 10 years than they previously had, both at the state and the federal level. So that's kind of a disaster waiting to happen. Aging infrastructure, more demands, less resources. Makes asset management really critical so you can prioritize and figure out how you best modernize this system so it can keep doing the critical functions it does. We took a look at what EPA was doing. We found they were doing some good asset management processes in regions of the country. They would do things like collect data from the states and localities on the condition and the age of these various monitoring sites to figure out where the priorities were for investment or for focus. But they didn't do that consistently. Other practices, again, you'd find in one region, but not nationwide. And it's a nationwide system. It really matters for it to be done in a strategic, coherent way. And so we directly recommended they needed to develop an asset management framework for the air quality monitoring system. They agreed to do so. They are still making progress on that. We haven't closed the recommendation, so it's not a fait accompli, but they are making efforts in that direction. So those are the 4 case studies, again, sort of an array of examples of how we are using asset management to audit programs, to suggest improvements to these agencies and how they manage really key national assets. We have ongoing work that'll be potentially of interest to you all, so just keep an eye on www.gao.gov. But 2 I'll highlight in particular. We have some ongoing work on deferred maintenance projects for federal real property. That'll be coming out in a year or so. And that is applying asset management framework principles. Also, our high risk list, which we update every 2 years. It represents federal programs that are either at the highest risk of fraud, waste, or abuse, or more relevant to us, in need of substantial transformation for reasons of efficiency, economy, effectiveness. That'll be coming out in 2023, most likely February, maybe March. And that'll have updates to two areas that are really important when it comes to asset management, where we've used these concepts very broadly. Again, managing federal real property, and then a relatively new high-risk area, limiting federal physical exposure to climate change risks. So keep your eyes tuned or on that. But with that, I will close and answer any questions. Very happy to have spoken with you today.